let me just ask you a couple of questions before we get into that. For example, where do you teach physics, and how long have you been doing that?
Okay, I'm currently teaching at a charter school in Central California in Visalia that is basically a K-12 charter school that works with homeschool families, so it's a very unusual kind of a school. I've taught physics for about 30 years, physics and math and so forth, internationally, in India, in Southern California, private schools, public schools. So I've taught all over. I've taught at Porterville College for 4 years, and so there's astronomy, physics, math, those types of topics are pretty much my niche.
Now, the physics that you work with in your analyses of the visual evidence, would you describe this as highly advanced physics, or would you describe it as more a basic level of physics?
It's the kind of stuff you'd get in the first month of a physics class. I mean, it's really, really basic. And the tools I use are, I guess, a little bit more advanced in the sense that it enables you to extract real measurement data from an ordinary video. And so it's really a cool way to present motion concepts to a class. And so I use this kind of thing in my teaching, and basically I had it available. So when I started looking into the issues on 9/11, it enabled me to not just sort of take people's word for things, but poke around on my own, and I started coming up with some interesting things, and that's where I really got into it.
Well, how did you first get involved in the 9/11 truth, area of research?
Mm-hmm. I usually credit my sister, who's not a science person at all. She's an English professor, but she went to a conference, was interested in this. She was friends with David Ray Griffin's wife, and so she got into this out of just interest and really recommended that I look into it. And so she brought home for one of those conferences some videos, and it was looking at those videos, which are things that have been on the internet forever now, but at the time it gave some perspectives that I hadn't really seen before. And the first thing about it that really intrigued me was, in terms of the physics of it, of course it's a catastrophe as far as the people involved, but as far as watching the buildings come down, they were so explosive in the way they came down, just in terms of the appearance, and the things that were thrown out sideways at apparently high speeds. And so the first thing I did that was actually a measurement was I just took a ruler and I freeze-framed it and went to the television screen itself and took some measurements and figured out the horizontal ejection speed of one of the major plumes of material. And it was obviously being led by it was like a big plume being shot off to the west that was being led by a large chunk of steel of some kind. And then I went on the internet and found out the dimensions of the building and all that, so I have some way to calibrate my measurements. And I basically concluded this stuff was coming off at upwards of 60 miles an hour, just from a crude measurement like that. And that's what hooked me in. And so it was just the fact that, hey, I really can tell something about this just by doing the measurements. So I got in, and Jim Hoffman's website is how I got my first education. I don't know if, just look up Jim Hoffman and 9/11, you'll find it. WTC7.
Yeah, 9/11 research.
Yeah, he has a bunch of sites, but they have the word they have WTC7 in the URL there. Anyway, that's a big URL. Anyway, find his stuff. I have links to that, by the way, on my page. So everything that I find really significant, I've linked to it on my page. So 911speakout.org, you can go to the links tab and so forth. But anyway, he has an exhaustive site. I mean, it's huge. But went through all the different aspects of this thing and found out what was known or what was being done in this area, and that's how I got my education on the subject. And then I started poking around on my own, and I basically, once I have a tool that does the video measurements. The first tool I used was called Physics Toolkit, and it wasn't very easy to use that one. It was it's one that I'd used in class, but They had a bunch of canned videos, and figuring out how to import new videos and that was a real trick. But I was able to use that, and then since then I've moved on to some others. The one I currently use is called Tracker, which is an open source, easily downloadable, very clean, easy to use piece of software. And anybody who wants to do any of this kind of stuff on their own, I have a little tutorial on how to use it right on my site. So that would be, if anybody has any kind of background in physics or in science or whatever and wants to try their hand at this kind of measurement, the tools are there and they're accessible to whoever wants to get into it. So anyway, that's how I got into it.
So you've actually you've looked at a wide array of questions. Let's talk about your results on the WTC7. You did an analysis of the rate of fall of the building, a very careful analysis using these tools that you've described, and you came up with results that contradict the claims that NIST had made in its draft report and in earlier
Right.
publications. Why don't you just describe what you did with the video of maybe which video did you select and what did you do with the video and what did you come up with, and then where did you go from there? Because it's really quite a remarkable result that you had in that you've managed to make NIST correct former mis-explanation or false claims about the buildings.
Right.
So why don't you run through that amazing story?
Okay. Well, again, it's like I started out on my end just out of curiosity, and I started looking at the motion of Building 7. Anybody who even just looks at it, they know something strange is going on. It does not. It doesn't come down like the towers did, like all this explosive stuff. It just sinks. I mean, the visual impression when I first saw it, I said, wow, this looks like it's just sinking right into the ground. And I had heard other people had done some measurement on it, and by timing how long it took for it to come down and so forth, and how close it was to free fall and things like this. But it was hard to see how they could get accurate results because you can't see the entire fall. You only see part of it. So I wanted to measure it for myself to know what the situation was. And the thing about this software I was using, it goes frame by frame. I mean, you can go every few frames or however you want to do it. But so I did every 0.2 of a second. And basically you can put a dot right on the frame, and then you step to the next one and put another dot on it. And when you place these dots on the screen, what happens is the software knows the pixel positions of those dots, and and so the timing, the frame rate of the video, you can figure that out. There's software that will tell you the frame rate. It's usually about a 1/30th of a second, but there's variation in frame rates. So anyway, in any case, so once you get the timing and you get the position, you can measure speeds, you can measure accelerations. And what I found was that the building was just holding steady until all of a sudden it just dropped. And I was using the northwest corner of the building, which is most of the video, in fact, I think pretty much all the video is pretty much from the north, looking at the building. So the top right corner of the building is what I'm looking at. And when it lets go, it just turns a corner, and it's on the graph. I'm just picturing this graph as I look at it. But when it's just horizontal, it means it's just holding steady. And then, boom, it just switches to a downward slope. And measuring the slope, it's pretty much right on the money free fall. And it continues in free fall for about 2.5 seconds. And there's, it's a little bit of interpretation there as far as NIST came out with 2.25 seconds. They were using a different point in the building is one difference, but so it's not enough to quibble about. So somewhere over 2 seconds worth of duration, it was in absolute free fall. After that point, it trailed off. What NIST had claimed.
It could have.
Go ahead.
It could have been even more than 2 seconds because this is just the portion that's visible on the videos, right? It could have continued at free.
No, that's not right. The part that's visible on the video, it shows the entire duration of free fall, And then towards the end, so after the 2.5 seconds, you can still see it on the video I used, and it actually trails off to a lesser amount of downward acceleration, and it finally actually starts to decelerate. So in other words, it is actually making an impact, which is slowing down the falling portion of the building eventually. But for the 2.5 seconds, which is equivalent to over 100 feet of drop, it fell with zero resistance. And I'll come back and talk more about free fall in a minute, but let me just say this. NIST claimed it was their final draft report. I mean, it was a final report, but it was for public comment. This was in August of 2008. So it was like they had done a couple of draft reports prior to that. But in the one that they released in August of 2008, they made the claim that it came down at 40%. It took 40% longer than free fall time is what they were doing. So they were measuring a time interval, and it's sort of like they were just using like a stopwatch, like you start and you stop, and you get a time interval for which they were claiming that this was 40% longer than free fall would have taken. Well, if it actually started the stopwatch at the moment the building started to come down, the corner of the building had started to come down, and stopped it within that first 2.5 seconds, they would have gotten it right on the money, free fall. What they did, though, was they found the disappearance time from they used a different video than I did, but where it was coming down into a notch between two buildings. And so they used the disappearance time, and then they used an artificially early start time. And they had some bizarre rationale for why they picked that as their start time. Basically, nothing was happening at the moment they started their clock. And so for that duration, they claimed, well, that amount of time was 40% longer than if it had come down at free fall. Right in the report, the NIST report, it had an equation which is based on, that's the equation they used to calculate the equivalent, the free fall time. And what they were doing is that equation is only valid if there's uniform acceleration during the time that they do their measurement. And they took the points so that it was holding steady for a couple of seconds, and then it was in free fall. So there was nothing close to being uniform motion during the time of their measurement. So it was a totally invalid calculation. I mean, it's something I would have marked it down on a first-year physics student's test for something like that, because it was a incorrect application of this formula. And so that was the basis that they put in this report, that it took 40% longer than free fall time. So I challenged them on that. Well, what happened was, being involved with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, I was in on the email circulation and so forth for that. And they have a team that I was on. So I got all these communications back and forth. And somebody said that there was going to be this tech briefing, but to get on, you had to be a scientist or an engineer with institutional affiliations, like some university or some corporation or something like that. And I'm just teaching high school physics. And so, but what I am is a member of the American Association of Physics Teachers, which I figured, well, I'm going to try it just to see if I can get in. So I submitted my name, and I put down American Association of Physics Teachers as my affiliation, and boom, they sent me a password. This happened 5 minutes before it started. I had all my stuff together, ready to walk out the door to go to school that morning, and I just checked in on the internet before I left, and there was my password. So I literally dropped what I had, sat down, and dashed off a question, and then sent it and walked off to school. And I didn't know for a couple of weeks whether they'd even asked the question or what happened. I mean, it was just sort of like I was just doing it blind. But then there is a piece of video that they made it very hard. You can't just download this video very easily. But we have some guys in AE 9/11 Truth that are more expert at this than I am, that they figured out a way to capture the video. And so there's a snippet of this video that I use in some of my videos that shows the way the question was asked and handled. And the question I basically asked was, I can probably almost quote it, but I'm not quite sure. So it's something like, any number of measurements have shown that the building came down at within a few percent. I was being generous there. Within a few percent of the acceleration of gravity. And I said, and yet NIST claims it took 40% longer than free fall. And I said, how can such a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity be set aside? So I just basically laid out the issue and let them respond, and that was it. And I just hit send and went to school. And you can see, if you go to 9/11 Speak Out, there's a couple of videos on the home page there, and the one at the bottom actually has it's called NIST Finally Admits Free Fall. At that conference, they didn't admit free fall, but they show Chandler. I've learned to say his name, I think, a little bit better than I did in the video. It looks like Shyam or something, but Sham, I think is the way he says it. Sham Sundar. And he's the director of this, the NIST investigation. And he tries to answer this thing, and he just goes all over the map trying to get around it. And he finally settles back down, and his argument is really interesting. And I actually give him more than, anyway, just trying to interpret his comments is so difficult because he's not even consistent within what he's saying. But he's basically, the way I took it for the purposes of responding to it was, he's saying it couldn't have happened because free fall is if there's no support. And there, in this case, there clearly was support. And there was a whole sequence of things that had to take place, and it couldn't have all taken place at once. So he's basically saying it couldn't come down in free fall, which is making our argument for us. But I mean, and so he's concluding then it came down 40% slower than free fall. However, in the process of when he's saying that, just in terms of Freudian slips and all that kind of thing, he's actually sort of, what he seems to be saying is that if you time it on the video, it comes down in 3.9 seconds, which is the free fall version of it. But their model shows that it comes down in 5.4 seconds. And the 3.9 seconds can't be right because, and he gives all this explanation. So it sounds like he's explicitly saying, well, on the video, it's 3.9 seconds, but our analysis shows it has to be 5.4 seconds, and therefore he's accepting the analysis over the direct evidence. And if you look at the direct evidence, it is in fact coming down at free fall. So it's sort of bizarre. He's sort of twisted up in the way he tried to explain that. But so it's an interesting response. Later in the same tech briefing, this is the technical briefing conference it was later in August 26th or something like that. Anyway, 2008. Anyway, later in the conference, Stephen Jones also got a question in. And his question was really simple. It was like, I mean, that's the thing. Throwing the simple questions are the ones that really get these guys. But the question is, there is a literal misprint as far as I'm concerned. It's a conceptual misprint. It's not really a typo. Somebody put the wrong words in there because they're being careless in their thinking. But they are exclaiming, assuming that the building came down at constant speed, which is clearly false, okay? But if you just look at the next paragraph, they're using this formula, which is valid only for constant acceleration. So it's like a slip-up. It's like a misstatement of some kind. But anyway, so Stephen Jones says, how come you're assuming it came down at constant speed when it looks like it's coming down at constant acceleration? Well, Shamsunder passes this question off to John Gross, who is one of the lead structural engineers in this whole investigation. And if you Google John Gross and 9/11, he has a very bizarre presence when he's answering these questions. He's very defensive. I mean, you can sort of tell he's lying just by listening to him. I mean, he's so tight. I don't know, he's really wired. But anyway, in this particular case, he goes on, I timed it, about 45 seconds worth of rambling in which he never addresses the question, and he basically just restates that they did their measurement, and it was 5.4 seconds. Notice their measurement that John Gross and his team came up with exactly, precisely matches the theoretical time that they had come up with. So it's pretty clear to me that he was getting his measurement in order to, he already had the 5.4 second target that he was going for, and he was just going to stretch this measurement to make it work. And if you look at that, it's pretty clear that that's what they did. But anyway, so his response was even more bizarre, and he was so nervous in that whole thing. He's a very bad liar. Okay, I mean, he doesn't do it smoothly. But anyway, so you just have to sort of watch those to understand where these guys are coming from on this. So anyway, that was it. So there was those two snippets in the conference. In addition, the actual formal process for addressing NIST on this issue was to submit a written, it was called a request for correction. All right. So in other words, they had a form that you had to follow when you submit this request for correction. And so I did that, and a number of other people in 8911 Truth did that, and others from outside of that group did that. And so there was really a team effort. There was a lot of us that were hounding NIST on this topic. So when people say I single-handedly did whatever, I don't think that's true. So anyway, but what I did was more visible and so forth. So I'm getting credit for that in a lot of people's minds. But it was a team effort.
Right. You made this video that went viral and everybody saw. So
yeah, that's right. So anyway, this one with Sunder and Gross, they were the stars of the show. I mean, hey, if they had just answered the questions reasonably, it would have been the end of the subject. There would have been nothing that happened. But the only reason this thing blew up in their faces was they were lying so badly. All John Gross would have had to said was, whoops, we meant to say acceleration. Let's change the word. And that would have been the end of it. And then for Shyam Sunder, I don't know. I gave him a harder question, really, because he's trying to justify how they set aside this obvious measurement. So, they had to, they had a problem trying to cope with something that was so out there in the open and so public. And so just bringing up the issue and letting them respond was what made this all come to the surface. Yeah.
Maybe they thought that since they had required anybody who would participate have an institutional affiliation, that all the questions would be congenial ones, softballs, and they just weren't prepared.
That's pretty much what happened. Yeah, that's pretty much what happened in the rest of the conference. Most of the questions were on. Yeah. Go ahead.
So all you guys, various people submitted these questions and requests for correction, and then in months, when NIST's final report came out, there were some changes to key sections, weren't there?
Well, the only thing
and then
they
also
changed,
right.
The only thing they really
sections that didn't change. Yeah.
That's right. The only thing they seem to have made a major change on was the free fall question, and so it was so unexpected on our part that they were going to act on that, because you could imagine all kinds of ways they could have dodged the bullet, but they didn't. And instead of just changing the word speed to acceleration, they actually did a complete reanalysis, which looks much more similar to the kind of analysis I did. They actually did a frame-by-frame type of a measurement, and their graph is inverted top to bottom compared to mine, but that's just the style of doing the graph. It doesn't mean anything. So in fact, NIST has a tendency to do this. I mean, when I do a measurement, it's usually going to be within the ballpark what I'm looking for, but there's always measurement error, and it's, if you're looking for free fall, if it's 9.85 or 9.82 or 9.78 or something like that, that's the kind of uncertainties that are common and typical when you're doing actual measurements. And so to actually get it nailed, when I say I nailed it, I got 9.88. Well, for New York City, the acceleration of gravity is 9.802. And but it's so close, it's within 1%, that it's virtually on the money as far as I'm concerned. But when NIST did their measurement, they were absolutely right smack on the number that they were using for acceleration of gravity, which was 9.81. So they weren't even using New York City's acceleration of gravity. They're just taking a standard one. And then they basically have their measurement come out and nail it right down to the decimal point, which is, it looks phony, just the way they've eliminated the little uncertainties that you would actually expect to be there. You see what I mean?
Yes, of course I do.
Any kind of measurement is going to have a little bit of fuzziness to it, and for them to actually nail these numbers right on the head, it just looks phony from the start. So that, in my mind, that contributes to my skepticism about it. But hey, what they came out with was free fall for 2.25 seconds. But then their graph went into this elaborate thing where they had a 3-phase collapse, in which the first phase was, it started off with basically no motion at all, and they sort of rounded into this acceleration thing. And then the graph they have in the third phase is after it started to decelerate towards the end. They just, the curve didn't fit at all with the data in there, but still, they fit this 2.25 seconds of free fall into a 5.4 second collapse interval, which made no sense whatsoever. There's no justification for that 5.4 second interval. But by putting it in the context, it's a phase of a longer collapse that took 5.4 seconds. So they're claiming things were happening inside the building that you couldn't really see, and that counts as part of the free fall, or part of the collapse of the building. And so they started their clock way back when they're asserting that stuff was happening. Yes?
If the building is stationary, as far as can be determined visually, then it's really not falling. So that doesn't really, that's not a valid approach.
That's right. Any fair-minded person will say, well, when it actually starts to come down is when you should start your clock if you want to know how fast did it fall. And so they're claiming that there's a process that was going on earlier. Well, of course there was a process that went on earlier. There was the East Penthouse had completely collapsed even seconds before that. And the building was actually swaying a bit. You can actually detect a number of kinds of movement of the building, but it didn't start when they said it started. It started before that. And it was ongoing during that whole interval. So it was like, yeah, the building is obviously being disrupted in some way, but then they artificially chose one point to start what they considered the collapse, which is a good second and a half at least before the building appears to collapse. And then they're claiming that that's the basis of their claim that it's 40% longer than free fall. So anyway, it just was, it was bizarre at the first, and now what they have is the admission of free fall in the middle phase of this 3-stage thing, but they're still asserting that it's still all consistent with their analysis. They did not change their analysis in the process of this.
And yet, but that's a contradiction, because Sham Sunder earlier had said that had there been any interval of free fall, this would have been proof that there was nothing underneath it to support the building.
That's right.
And so if they've admitted free fall, logic would dictate that they would have to change their earlier explanation of how the building came down.
Right. So I basically started making my little video analysis of this and presentation of it, and it got to be so long I cut it into parts. So the first part just is the tech briefing and a little bit of discussion. I was going to make part 2 be the implications of free fall. Now that we have free fall, what does that tell us, right? But in between, I got in there and started wondering how did they come up with this 5.4 seconds? And so I did a part 2 that was actually just frame counting, and took John Gross's measurement and found that there was nothing at all going on during that time when he started his clock. So that one is sort of an in-between. So it turned out to be a 3-part series. And the part 3, then I get into the implications of free fall. And the implications of free fall are exactly what Sham Sunder said they are. it means there's no structure. Now, you got to realize this building is huge, and from side to side, it's 100 meters, which is, I mean, it's a little bit more than the length of a football field, which is 100 yards. Okay, and it's close to half the height of the towers. It's 47 stories. The towers are 110. So it's a huge building, would pretty much occupy the entire area of a football field. And for something like that to just come straight down with a level roof line means it's falling right through itself at free fall. It means that you have a sudden elimination of support across the entire width of the building for a span of about 8 floors at least, that had to have been eliminated within a fraction of a second. So, I want to make one other comment. When you see in some of the videos, it looks like there's a kink in the roof line. Okay? The video I used, the reason I used the video I did was it was easier for doing my measurement. It was looking face right on to the north face, and the roof line looks perfectly horizontal. And the reason for the different views of the roof line is the roof line was not a vertical kink, it was a horizontal kink. So, in other words, if you think of a book and you bend it, I don't know, I'm doing this with my hands in the air. You can't see that, can you? But imagine that so if you're going to draw the kink, you're going to draw in a horizontal plane. It sort of folds sideways rather than folding up and down, okay? Is that reasonably clear? Okay. So it's not as though part of the building is leading the rest, but from the diagonal view that they use, it looks that way. Okay, so anyway, this thing just suddenly dropped, and the entire thing stays horizontal as it just comes down. And it's just amazing. And it can't happen unless you have a sudden removal of all of that vertical support across the entire 100 meters and all the width of the building and so forth. And there's no way any natural progressive collapse kind of a process like they're asserting can do that. There are times when you can have a process that might trigger a sudden cascade of some sort, but it's not going to be uniform across the whole building like what you're seeing there.
No, it's pretty obvious visually, intuitively that for something to come down straight down like that with an even level roof line, that there has to have been removal of material underneath it equally level, essentially all the way across, as you said, all the way across the width of the building, and it has to have been done very suddenly to allow the building to just take off and accelerate at gravitational rate. It's I just don't see how they can admit free fall and then not have to change their sequence of events that they claim led to the fall of the building. But I guess they're relying on the scientific ignorance of the American public. But there are a lot of people out there who are not ignorant of this. There are engineers and scientists and so forth who they know how this stuff works, and it should be so blatantly obvious. But there's so many hurdles you have to go across to get your mind in the kind of a place where you can even start to accept the implications, Once you say Building 7 had to have been wired for explosives, it couldn't have happened like that all in a day. Therefore, you're talking about loading it with explosives over a period of time, which means foreknowledge and complicity, and it had to have been with access. I mean, you can't sneak this stuff in. That's the objection people typically raise. No, it wasn't snuck in. You had guys with uniforms on, like they're workers on this or that project or whatever, and they just wave them on through security, and so either security or the people above security were in on it. And it was, they probably closed off sections of various floors at various times and did their work, and it probably took months. And same with the towers. And so, I mean, like when Niels Herrick got asked this kind of question, how did they get this stuff into the buildings? He said, well, on pallets.
I mean, yeah, they just rolled it on in there, and people aren't going to think twice about it because all kinds of construction work goes on all the time. So it would be easy to, they'd say, how could they have done it, and it had to be secret. It didn't have to be secret at all. So they got the stuff in, but it does show foreknowledge and complicity, and inside connections, because you couldn't be an outsider and get that kind of access. Building 7 was a highly secure building, and if you look at the list of occupants, and I don't have the list in front of me, but it's FBI and CIA and banks and all kinds of people like that had offices in Building 7. And
it has to have been one of the most secure buildings in New York City for sure.
Sure. So it was. Okay. So anyway, Go ahead.
I would say that, beyond that NIST's report, even its final report, qualifies as a member of this set of complicit entities. The report qualifies, in my view, as a cover-up. Essentially,
it is.
They've been forced to uncover, bits and pieces, but they've massively suppressed evidence of explosions, etc. They've used a fake, they've used a black box computer model that they won't allow anyone to examine, and then they present an explanation that is obviously false. So this is a cover-up. So they're part of this large-scale operation, and I think your work on the rate of fall of WTC7 really makes that point very, very sharply. You did also some very fine analyses of the two towers, and the NIST had presented an explanation of how the two towers disintegrated, which has a lot of problems as well. And on some of your videos, you identify visible physical phenomena that directly contradict the descriptions that NIST presents of what happened. Would you like to run through your general analysis of the takedown of the North Tower, and maybe highlight where what you see differs from what NIST claimed?
Okay. By the way, can I put a plug in here first? If you go to my website, 911speakout.org, I basically have collected, it's not every single one, but most of my videos. I'm putting them on a DVD, and that's going to be out within a few days here. So if you want to see all of this, what I've done is I have my videos that are there on the website, but then I have them interwoven with commentary where I describe a little bit more of the background that sort of weaves them together. So that's going to be available if people are interested. It ought to be available within this next week. In any case, the major measurement that I did on the North Tower, and the reason we're focusing on the North Tower was hit high, and so the section above the plane impact was only about a dozen floors. The South Tower was hit lower, and there's a lot more floors above it. And when the South Tower started to come down, the top essentially tipped, and it falls into the dust cloud, and there's some indication that it sort of just tipped on over but disintegrated in the process, and there's other indications that it might have. Some people say, well, the rotation stopped, and it can't stop. Conservation of angular momentum says it couldn't have. But so interpreting what exactly happened to it is a little bit more problematic. But you can actually see at least significant parts of it just continue to tumble off to the east. Okay. By the way, I've gotten very fluent in the geography of this. I've never been to New York City, but the geography of that whole area is. Go to Google Earth, and they have you can import the towers back into Google Earth and put them there, and so you can get a sense of how all this was laid out and everything.
Well, that's a good idea.
Yeah. Anyway, the North Tower, the top section came down almost straight down. It actually tipped a little bit away from the camera, but not as much as some people claim. It tipped maybe a degree or two at the beginning, and then it came straight down, and then it tipped more afterwards. So, but as far as the part that we're observing there, it's coming down more or less straight down. And so it's easier to get a meaningful measurement of its acceleration. And so early on, I figured, well, here's another building. Let's see. I mean, people throw around these claims without really verifying them. It was claimed that it came down at free fall or near free fall or something. And I did a measurement, and nope, not near free fall even. Well, near is a relative term. It came down about 2/3. It's 64% of free fall. And so I just set it aside because that answered that question, that these claims were out of line. But it was still remarkable how quickly it came down. And Richard Gage came back and asked me again. He wanted to get a good measurement because he had been using these in his talks and all that, and he wanted to make sure he was saying it right. And so I went and did a measurement using my tracking software again, and nailed it that, yep, it's at 64% of free fall. But then I started thinking about it, and like, what would it take in terms of resistive force to slow down the rate of acceleration, the downward acceleration, without actually decelerating it or stopping it or whatever? Or what kind of force is necessary to do that? And I go through the analysis. I have a video that does that, and in the process of figuring this out, it's one of those things where you launch into solving a problem, and the answer surprised me in the process. That what it came out with was that the force of interaction between the top section of the building and the bottom section of the building, which, by the way, remember, was undamaged. I mean, the bottom section of the building was more massive, stronger, and it was undamaged. And the top, in other words, it tapered in strength as you went upward. And so here is a small, weaker section crashing onto a larger, stronger section. And by the fact that it continued to accelerate downward, here comes the physics, guys. By the fact that it continually accelerated downward the entire time that roof line was visible, which was close to that dozen floors, okay? So during that interval, the fact that it accelerated downward the whole time means the net force is downward. I mean, you're going to accelerate in the direction of the net force. What do I mean by net force? There's two forces acting. There's gravity acting downward, and then there's upward force of resistance that all the bottom structure was pushing up, preventing it from just free-falling, right? So think of a little block and a downward arrow representing gravity and a smaller upward arrow representing resistance. Okay? And so the fact that it's coming down at 2/3 of acceleration of gravity, to round it off a bit, means that the upward force is only 1/3 of the weight of the upper block. Now, final step in the argument. When two things interact, the forces between them are equal and opposite. That's Newton's third law of motion. So if I hit you in the face, you're hitting my fist with your face. And the force on my fist is slowing my fist down, and my fist is, you see what I'm saying? It's actually pushing in both directions.
Yes.
If a football player hits somebody else on the field, might accelerate that person, but the person who's in the way slows down the guy who is running. You see? It works both ways.
Yes.
So in this case, what you have is the 1/3 weight upward resistive force translates to a 1/3 weight downward force that the top section is exerting on the bottom section of the building. So here is this section exerting only 1/3 of its weight. So it would have exerted 3 times as much force downward if it were simply sitting there. And so what it's telling you is that there's no way that this thing with that little force is going to crush the building. The building was designed not only to support the weight of this top block, it was designed to weigh 3 to 5 times that, because they have, there's margin of error in there, right? Safety margin. So
this means there's
go ahead.
No way that there was the so-called pile driver effect.
Yeah. If you take a hammer and you hit a nail, and the hammer exerts a larger force on the nail than simply the weight of the hammerhead normally, right? I mean, the hammerhead has some weight, but if you just set the hammer on the nail's not going to sink into the wood, right? Unless you're going into styrofoam or something. But so by swinging the hammer down, you're used to the idea that it's going to exert a larger force on the nail than its own weight. However, in the process of exerting that larger force, where is that larger force coming from? It has momentum as it's coming down, and it gives up its momentum, and that transfers into what's called an impulse. So the force on the nail is coming from the loss of momentum of the hammer. So as you lose momentum, it translates into increased force. And the only way that can happen is for the hammerhead itself to slow down. And guess what? You hit a nail, and typically, unless you're a real macho guy that just drives it in one stroke, but if you basically hit a nail and it slows down the hammerhead till it stops, then you lift the hammer and you do it again. I mean, the very fact that you have to hit repeatedly indicates the nail is stopping the hammerhead, and it's in the stopping of the hammerhead that the force is created that drives the nail. You see what I mean?
Yes.
So that was not happening in the case of the World Trade Center because this thing never slowed down. Tony Zambodi is an engineer I think he's in New Jersey, and he and Graham McQueen wrote a paper called The Missing Jolt, and it's on the Journal of 9/11 Studies. And this one actually predated my articles on there, but my analysis and their analysis are very, very close. They're like two sides of the same coin. They're saying, you should have expected a jolt when one thing impacted the other. And so, in other words, that sort of complements the perspective I was bringing to it. So, this jolt's not there. It just smoothly accelerates the entire time that it's visible. So, what does it mean? That it's not what is collapsing the building. It is not destroying the building because there's no impact that would enable it to do that. The reason it's accelerating downward is the stuff that's underneath has been blown out of the way. And so
now in your videos,
you basically have pulverized all this material underneath the falling section, and so the falling section is allowed to continually pick up speed as it falls through. Go ahead.
And on your video analysis of the North Tower, you were actually able to identify a wave of explosions ahead of the falling mass, explosions going downward in a series ahead of the falling mass.
Okay, you're referring to... Okay, go ahead. Yeah, there's another video I have, that actually shows that.
And
a couple of videos, actually.
These are not... go ahead.
Right. If you look at... there's a video that's pulled way back, and it shows the entire collapse from the north. And if you look on the right-hand edge of the North Tower, the west-facing edge, you can see that there's a whole wave of horizontal ejection of low in the building, way, way ahead of where the collapse is happening. If you go to my website, the title of that one is, I believe, Acceleration and Serendipity or something like that. And that was something I was looking at. I was trying to extend this previous one where I was saying, what happens after the top descends into the cloud? Does it keep on accelerating? Well, you can't see the roof line. But I ran a couple of markers down the side, keeping pace with acceleration of gravity, and a second marker being at 2/3 acceleration of gravity. And in fact, the acceleration does slow down a bit as the building continues to fall. However, once the markers get down below that, the plume of debris, what you notice is that right up, keeping pace with the red marker on that video, which is the one that's coming at 2/3 G, you see this wave of explosive ejections. And if this were something propagating downward through the building, actually physically falling through the building, it's falling as fast or faster than the debris falling only through the air just a few feet away. I mean, it's crazy. And so how do you get this stuff keeping pace. Keeping pace with that kind of a fall rate. And the only way I can see that could happen is it's not anything coming down through the building. It's a wave. It's like timed explosions that are going off in sequence, running down the side of the building. So these are, in my mind, they have to take out the core columns. They're taking out a lot of other stuff along the way, but it's being done using explosives. I want to say this other thing. My analysis is all actually the simple physics, the physics of motion and so forth. But there's other people involved in this whole thing, like Stephen Jones and Niels Harrit and Jeffrey, I forget how you say his last name, Farrer or something, Farrer, yeah, and various others who have investigated the dust. And people really need to keep in mind that the actual identification of nanothermite has taken place in the dust. This has no business being in the dust from any natural means. And anybody who tells you, oh, that just happened because there was iron oxide and aluminum in the buildings, they're blowing smoke. This stuff was made of nanoparticles. You can't grind things down to nanoparticles. I mean, if you just try to grind things that fine, you're not going to do it. It has to be built up from atoms to actually create these little nanoparticles like that. So this is a very, very obviously highly engineered military-grade explosive that's manufactured at places like Lawrence Livermore and various other national labs like that. It's sort of like, the genetic fingerprints of the anthrax virus. They initially were going to blame Saddam Hussein, and they discovered, the DNA, it shows it came from U.S. military installations. Whoops, the investigation ceases. It all just sort of evaporated. Where did that go? Well, here we have it again. You have an identification of nanoparticle size ingredients making up something which resembles and behaves like thermite. And they've actually gotten this stuff to explode in their little test situations in the lab. So whether it's actually explosive in the literal sense of creating a concussion, or whether it's just a very tailorable incendiary that was used to pre-weaken this or that, the use of it isn't necessarily the point. The point is this stuff implicates somebody with very high government connections and military connections in this whole process. So it's being stonewalled, and people are relying on the ignorance of the general public to be able to somehow sweep this aside as somehow, well, that's not significant. And you keep hearing statements like, oh, well, there's rust and there's aluminum in the buildings, therefore it could have sort of been manufactured on the fall. It's total baloney. I mean, that's totally, it has to be a conscious lie on the part of anybody who's knowledgeable who's making that claim. Because it's well, you're right, that is so far-fetched that somebody who doesn't know better might say, oh, well, maybe that's just another opinion. Well, it's not a valid opinion by a long shot. It's avoiding admitting the obvious.
It seems that there's abundant evidence of many different kinds that all three buildings, the two towers and Building 7, were brought down by controlled demolition. They were different in the technical approach taken, but all three of them clearly were demolished. It seems there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. There were other buildings damaged. I just wondered, did you ever take a look at any of the photos of WTC 6?
Oh yeah. There's buildings that are much more. There are buildings that are much more heavily damaged than Building 7. That the remnants of them stood. And like, for instance, the Millennium Hotel there, Millennium Hotel, I may have gotten the wrong name. One of the World Trade Center buildings is actually a hotel, and it had a big gouge taken out of the.
David.
Excuse me. It's WTC 3.
We just have 1 minute left.
Okay. Anyway, it had a huge gouge taken out when the South Tower fell, and it was finally demolished when the North Tower fell. But it didn't just come tumbling down like Building 7 did. And the same with some of these bank buildings and all that, all surrounding it. So these 3 buildings obviously had something going on that these other buildings didn't. It was not a natural event.
And all three of the buildings were very secure, so access was off limits to Al Qaeda, we can say.
Mm-hmm.
You've put out an amazing amount of information, David, and I recommend website 911speakout.org to our listeners very highly. All the videos are there. You can also go to Resist Radio Forum to the show page and get the link to his website. He's got a great new DVD coming out, so I think it would be worth buying. And he says he's got additional interpretation on that DVD that explains them. David, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.